It is one of the most bitter and dangerous rivalries in the modern world, yet it was not always this way. Iran and Israel, two nations that today trade threats of annihilation and launch missiles at each other's territory, were once remarkably close allies. To understand how this relationship collapsed so completely, you have to go back to a time when the Middle East looked very different, and when the interests of these two nations were surprisingly aligned. In the 1950s and 60s, Iran was ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a monarch who had consolidated power with significant backing from the United States and Britain. The Shah's Iran was a secular, modernizing state, all deeply embedded in the Western-aligned bloc during the Cold War. Israel, for its part, was a young nation surrounded by hostile Arab neighbors, desperately seeking regional partners wherever it could find them. These shared circumstances created a natural, if quiet, partnership. The two countries established diplomatic ties and developed extensive cooperation in intelligence, military training, and trade. Israel's foreign intelligence agency, the Mossad, worked closely with Savak, the Shah's feared secret police. Israeli agricultural and technical experts helped develop Iranian infrastructure. Iran, in return, supplied Israel with oil, a critical resource given that Arab nations had imposed embargoes on the Jewish state. This was not a relationship built on deep cultural affinity or ideological brotherhood. It was pragmatic, strategic, and mutually beneficial, but it worked, and for nearly 3 decades it held. The earthquake that shattered this alliance arrived in 1979. The Iranian Revolution, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, overthrew the Shah and replaced his secular monarchy with an Islamic republic built on a radically different ideological foundation. Almost overnight, the political calculus of the entire Middle East shifted. Khomeini's worldview was deeply hostile to what he called arrogance, meaning the domination of Muslim lands by foreign powers, and he identified the United States and Israel as the primary embodiments of this arrogance. For Khomeini, Israel was not merely a political adversary, but a symbol of Western imperialism planted in the heart of the Muslim world. His government severed diplomatic ties with Israel immediately, handed the Israeli embassy in Tehran over to the Palestine Liberation Organization, and declared Israel an illegitimate entity that had no right to exist. The rhetoric was fierce and uncompromising from the very beginning. Khomeini declared that the liberation of Jerusalem was a religious duty for all Muslims, and he institutionalized this position by establishing Quds Day, an annual day of protest held on the last Friday of Ramadan, dedicated to expressing solidarity with Palestinians and opposition to Israel. This was not just political posturing. It became a foundational pillar of the Islamic Republic's identity, woven into its constitution, its foreign policy, and its national narrative. Israel watched these developments with alarm. The loss of Iran as a partner was a serious strategic blow, but the emergence of an ideologically driven revolutionary government that openly called for Israel's destruction was something far more threatening. What had been a partnership built on shared interests had transformed into an existential confrontation built on irreconcilable worldviews. The hostility between Iran and Israel did not immediately translate into direct military confrontation. Instead, it developed through a complex architecture of proxy relationships and regional power struggles that would define the conflict for decades. Iran's most significant strategic investment was in Lebanon, where it helped create and fund Hezbollah in the early 1980s following Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Hezbollah became Iran's most powerful proxy, a heavily armed militant organization and political movement that positioned itself on Israel's northern border. From Iran's perspective, Hezbollah was both a deterrent and a forward operating force, capable of striking Israel without requiring direct Iranian involvement. From Israel's perspective, Hezbollah represented an Iranian military presence on its doorstep, a constant and credible threat. The relationship between Iran and various Palestinian militant groups, particularly Hamas and Islamic Jihad, further deepened the conflict. Iran provided funding, weapons, and training to these organizations, which carried out attacks against Israeli civilians and military targets. Israel viewed this support as Iranian aggression conducted through intermediaries, a deliberate strategy to bleed Israel through a network of armed groups spread across multiple fronts. This proxy architecture gave Iran significant leverage while maintaining a degree of plausible deniability. It also meant that the conflict between Iran and Israel was never confined to their two countries alone. It played out across Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, drawing in other regional actors and creating a web of interconnected conflicts that made resolution extraordinarily difficult. Israel responded to this strategy with its own approach, conducting strikes against weapons shipments destined for Hezbollah in Syria, targeting Iranian military advisors, and commanders operating in the region, and carrying out covert operations against Iran's nuclear program. The conflict had become a shadow war, fought through proxies, assassinations, cyber attacks, and targeted strikes, with both sides carefully calibrating their actions to avoid triggering a full-scale war. No single issue has done more to escalate the tension between Iran and Israel than Iran's nuclear program. Israel has long maintained that a nuclear-armed Iran would represent an existential threat, a regime that openly calls for Israel's destruction, possessing the means to carry it out. This fear has driven some of the most dramatic episodes in the conflict's history. Iran insists that its nuclear program is entirely peaceful, intended for energy production and medical research. The international community has been deeply skeptical, and years of negotiations, sanctions, and inspections have reflected this skepticism. For Israel, the question was never primarily about international law or treaty obligations. It was about survival. In 2010, a sophisticated cyber weapon known as Stuxnet, widely attributed to a joint American and Israeli operation, destroyed hundreds of Iranian centrifuges and set back the nuclear program by an estimated 2 years. Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated in a series of killings that Iran attributed to Israel and the Mossad. In 2021, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, considered the father of Iran's nuclear weapons program, was killed in an elaborate ambush near Tehran using a remote-controlled machine gun. Iran blamed Israel. These operations reflected Israel's doctrine of prevention, the idea that it could not afford to wait until Iran actually built a nuclear weapon before acting. Every Israeli government, regardless of political orientation, has treated the Iranian nuclear program as a red line. This position has sometimes put Israel at odds with its American ally, which has periodically pursued diplomatic solutions that Israel viewed as insufficient. The 2015 nuclear deal, known formally as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, temporarily reduced tensions by placing significant restrictions on Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Israel opposed the deal vigorously, arguing that it merely delayed rather than eliminated the threat. When the United States withdrew from the agreement in 2018 under President Donald Trump, Iran gradually resumed and expanded its nuclear activities, bringing the two countries closer to the brink than ever before. For decades, both Iran and Israel maintained an unspoken understanding that their conflict would remain indirect, fought through proxies and covert operations rather than direct military strikes. That understanding began to break down in 2024 when the shadow war finally stepped into the open. Following a series of escalating incidents, including an Israeli strike on an Iranian consular building in Damascus that killed senior Iranian military commanders, Iran launched an unprecedented direct attack on Israeli territory in April of 2024, firing over 300 drones and missiles at Israel. It was the first time Iran had ever directly attacked Israel from its own soil. Israel and its allies, including the United States, Jordan, and Britain, intercepted the vast majority of the projectiles. Israel responded with a limited strike inside Iran. These exchanges marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict. The two countries had crossed a threshold that many analysts had long feared, moving from a proxy war conducted in the shadows to direct military confrontation conducted in full view of the world. The roots of this confrontation stretch back to 1979, to an ideology that made opposition to Israel a cornerstone of national identity, and to decades of proxy conflicts, nuclear brinkmanship, and covert warfare that steadily eroded the barriers against direct confrontation. What began as a pragmatic alliance between two regional powers became one of the defining rivalries of the modern era, shaped by revolution, religion, geopolitics, and the enduring question of who controls the future of the Middle East. The conflict between Iran and Israel is not simply a dispute between two governments. It is a collision between two visions of what the region should look like, and that collision shows no sign of ending.